I am Jim Blow, and I'm the admin coordinator here at the Science Museum of Virginia, and the host for Lunch Break Science. And just occasionally, I get to step in and do a presentation about various aspects of science history, which is something I really, really love to do. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into today's presentation. Today, I'll be presenting Charles Babbage, Ada Lovelace, and their Victorian Clockwork computer. First of all, what we think about now as a computer is obviously an electronic device. But before that, there were obviously other tools that people used in order to do complex math. A lot of times it was just someone sitting down with maybe just a pencil and paper and just running the math. Then they came into use different types of tools. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those tools. One of those was a thing called a table book. So a table book was basically a massive collection of tables. So if you needed a logarithm, for example, what you would do is you would go to the table book and you would find the value for the logarithm that you needed. So this was very important for doing things like navigation, surveying, that type of thing. So they had table books for all sorts of things, actuarial tables, astronomical tables. And all of these required complex mathematics to work out all of these values. The thing is that at the time, the only way in which one could do it was someone had to actually sit down and do the equations. So the way they put these things together is they would have a mathematician basically sit down and write out the equation, and then they would calculate what were called pivot values. So they'd say logarithm of 100 and then 105, 110. So the mathematician goes down the line and works out these pivot values. Then what they do is they give the equations to a group of what are called computers or calculators. And these people would basically sit down and run out these equations for every single value in between. And then hopefully what would happen is, let's say the mathematician had worked out pivot values for 100 and 105. So hopefully what will happen is by the time your human calculator gets to 105, the number matches up what the mathematician had already come up with. So that sounds fine as far as it goes. It's tedious, it takes a lot of work, and it's extremely prone to error, which if you are navigating a ship using one of these table books and there's an error that's not known, it's been called the equivalent of a hidden rock that the ship could run into and sink. And that could literally happen. If you had a navigational error, your ship might not go where you intended. And losing a ship was a very, very big deal. It was a significant investment. But it could cause other problems besides just losing a ship. Okay, so there were 4 ways in which errors could creep in. Calculation, so you can end up with a math error. You can end up with a transcription error. When you're setting the type, because remember, each one of those numbers was a little individual piece of movable type. So if you're setting it into the frame and that falls out, maybe it doesn't get put back in exactly the correct order. And then also in proofreading, there could also be errors there. So there are 4 different ways that errors could creep in. And frequently what would happen with these table books is they would have to publish what were called errata. And an errata is basically a sheet that would go with the table book, letting people know that, hey, there's an error here. And it would often happen there would be errata for the errata. So you would have a mistake that was in the correction, which would require another correction to be published. So as you can see, this is not a great way to do business, but it's the best they had at the time. So this really starts to bother one gentleman in particular. And he is the main subject of the presentation today, and he's Charles Babbage. Charles Babbage was born in 1791. He was the son of a banker, and he was, as a child, very precocious and curious. He would break open his toys to find out what was inside them, but he was clearly very, very intelligent. So he attends Cambridge, showed great skill at mathematics while he was at Cambridge, but he had a tendency to say what was on his mind in a way that was probably not very decorous. Babbage had the habit of, if he thought he was right about something, it gave him license to be rude about it. And he frequently did this to his detriment, including when he was at Cambridge. He blew a very, very important oral examination. His thesis that he was going to defend was considered blasphemous by the examiners. So they failed him on the spot. So failing these honors examinations at Cambridge was a very, very big deal indeed, and it would affect Babbage's career throughout the rest of his life. So he was widely published in scientific journals, did not get a lot of teaching positions. Again, the fact that he failed these honors examinations at Cambridge did not put him in good stead later in life. But it didn't entirely ruin his chances, as we'll discuss. So one day in 1821, Babbage is with his good friend John Herschel, who was an astronomer of some note, who would have a very illustrious career in British science. So the two of them are working on these tables, and they had gotten the values back from the calculators, and they're working on them, and they find mistake after mistake after mistake. And Babbage finally says, "I wish to God these calculations had been executed by steam." Meaning, in essence, he wished that there was a machine that could do this so that it would take human error out of the equation. And that really gets Babbage thinking. And he actually comes up with an idea to come up with a machine that can do this. So as I mentioned, he was a brilliant polymath. He had many, many different interests. He was always tinkering in things. He was interested in reforming science and making it a serious pursuit and not just something that was the playground of people that were wealthy enough and had enough free time to do it, which is something we're definitely going to talk about later when we talk about his dealings with the Royal Society. So as I mentioned, he was a stubborn curmudgeon. If he was right, he felt like it gave him license to be rude about being right. But he was also a party guy. He liked to entertain. He liked to have dinner parties at his home. He had a reputation as something of a dapper gentleman, a snappy dresser. And what would have a great influence on his life was his wife, Georgiana, who he married in 1814. The very happy marriage. They had 8 children, 3 of which survived. 1 daughter and 2 sons survived past infancy. Babbage's father was very, very much opposed to the marriage. They had a huge falling out about it. And Babbage always felt that he needed to live up to his father's expectations. That was something that really haunted him throughout his life. And again, that's something we're going to talk more about as we go. All right. So, as I mentioned, Babbage came up with a concept for this machine that could do these values, it could do these complicated equations. And it called it the difference engine. And that's because of the specific method that it used to calculate. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the method of finite differences, which is this really clever way of working out what are called polynomial equations. I'm a historian, not a mathematician, so you're going to have to bear with me here. If we do have any mathematicians in the audience, I can almost guarantee I'm not going to explain this very well, because, again, I got my degrees in history for a reason, because I'm not great at this sort of math. But here we go. We're going to look at it anyway. So we're talking about this beast right here. That is difference engine number 1. So this is the device that Babbage conceived. So as you can see up at the top left there, it's got a crank. And what you would do is you would set your equation, and then you would just turn the crank. And what it would do is the machine would spit out a value. And it was based on how the equation was set up. That was the answer that you could get. And it did this in a very, very clever way. What it used was a method called, as I mentioned, the method of differences. So in order to use the method of differences to solve these types of equations, all you needed to know how to do was add. So Babbage's machine only needed to be able to add. It didn't need to be able to subtract or multiply or divide. All it needed to do was add. So the method of differences works like this. So if you look on the far right there, you see where it says delta 2. So that means you just add 2 to your result to get the next result. So then if you look in the second column, very top, it says 1. And then 1 row down, 1 column to the right, it says 3. So you add 1 to 3, get 4. 4 to 5, get 9, and so on and so on. So if you look, you may notice it was pointed out to me the last time I did this, there's actually an error on the very last line, which illustrates very nicely why it would be better to have a machine do these kinds of things than have a human do it. So Babbage knew that his machine, in order to be able to deal with all four of the types of errors that could creep in with creating mathematical tables, he knew it had to be able to calculate and it had to be able to print. He envisioned that this thing would have a printer so that when you got the result, it could either print out on paper or it could print out on maybe paper mache to make an engraving plate, or it could print out on a thin copper plate. So he's got this very worked out concept of how the difference engine would work. So how do we get the thing to work? So Babbage figures out eventually that he is going to probably have to get government support to build the thing, because here is the state of manufacturing in England in the 1820s, and really everywhere for that matter. There was no such thing as standardized fasteners or standardized equipment. So a screw that you got in Manchester would not be the same as a screw that you purchased in London or Newcastle. Everything would be different. It would all depend on the tool maker that made the thing. And they were called tool makers for a reason. They made their very own tools. And typically when a tool maker would do a job, he would make his own tools. And then when he completed the job, he would take his tools with him. Babbage's machine would have needed very, very precisely machined parts that were almost identical and a large quantity of them. So that was something that in Britain just did not exist at the time. It didn't exist anywhere. There was no capability to make large quantities of standardized parts in the way that Babbage would have needed. But Babbage goes all around England looking for manufacturing methods. Almost always traveled by the road. Sometimes he took his wife along with him. And he didn't stay in the expensive inns. He would stay in taverns so that he could talk with people that worked in the field, so he could get their feel for how the actual work of manufacturing was done. And he finally comes up with a book called On the Economy of Machinery and Manufactures. It's largely based on this grand tour that he took trying to figure out these methods for manufacturing machinery very precisely. So in 1822, he does make a small working model, which unfortunately has not survived. But we know that he made it because it was in his memoirs that he made the thing. But unfortunately, again, we do not have it. So as I mentioned, Babbage finally realizes around 1822, 1823 that he's going to need government support in order to build his machine. So he starts petitioning the crown to give him some cash so he can get this thing done. So Babbage he was a man of some means. He wasn't exactly wealthy at the time, but he was well off by the standards of the day. And he's also very well connected. He was a member of the Royal Society. He did move in circles in the high society of Britain. So he was very well connected. And finally, in 1823, the crown decides, after having kicked it back to the Royal Society for valuation, the crown decides that they are going to give him some money. So Babbage meets with this gentleman, F.J. Robinson, who is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Robinson gives Babbage £1,500 to build the difference engine. So here's where a long-standing problem comes in. There's no real contract drawn up at this point. So there's no question of, will Babbage get more money in the future? When is the date the engine's going to be completed? None of that is worked out. It's just Babbage is given £1,500 to build his machine, just based on the recommendation of the Royal Society, which in no small part was aided by John Herschel, who was in good standing in the Royal Society and a lifelong friend of Babbage. So Babbage gets this £1,500 to build his machine, and Babbage has already spent a great deal of his own money to try to build the thing. So just to give you some idea of the amount of money we're talking about in 1820s British pounds. In 1831, there was a brand new locomotive called the John Bull that was completed for delivery to the United States. A total cost for this locomotive was £730. So that's enough basically to buy 2 locomotives. So it was not a tiny amount of money. It's $1,500 doesn't sound like a lot, but in 1820s, it was a fortune. So Babbage sets about figuring out how he's going to build this thing. So he needs a toolmaker, and he needs a really, really good toolmaker. And he engages a man named Joseph Clement, who has a reputation as being the best there is at engineering and toolmaking. So Joseph Clement was very gruff. He had a tendency to overcharge people, and he was to the point of belligerence when he was trying to collect money. And the line that I have there, you have ordered a first-rate article and you must be content to pay for it, that might as well be Joseph Clement's motto. He was very well aware of the quality of the work that he did, so he fully expected that people would fork out the money for it once he had done his job. And one good example of that is this little interaction he had with this man right here. This is Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and he was the creator of the Great Western Railway in Britain. Well, one time he had ordered these steam whistles for his trains, and he was very, very dissatisfied with them. He thought the sound of them was very weak and reedy, and he wanted something that was just really booming, so people from all around could hear the train was coming. So he goes to Clement, and Clement looks over the sample that he's brought, and Clement basically says that a candle maker could have done better than this. So Clement makes up a sample, and it is just thunderous. It's so loud. And Brunel loves it. He says, "Make me up 100." So Clement duly dashes off 100 of these train whistles and then comes back to Brunel and presents him with the bill. And it was 6 times the cost of the old whistles. And Brunel is just refusing to pay this. He thinks it's an exorbitant amount of money. So Brunel says, "There's no way I'm paying this amount." And Clement comes back with, "My whistles are more than 6 times better than the ones you had. You ordered a first-rate article. Now I expect to be paid for it." So it ends up going through arbitration. Clement wins and gets his money. And this happened time and again. As I mentioned, Clement had somewhat of a tendency to overcharge. It would invariably end up in arbitration, and Clement would invariably win. So this would happen time and time again. But Clement was indeed as good as people thought he was, which is why Babbage hired him. So Babbage engages Clement to build the difference engine, and work kind of starts on it. It's dragging kind of slowly. By this time, Babbage has moved on to what's called difference engine number 2, which would have been a massive machine, 8 feet high, 7 feet long, 3 feet deep, weighed 15 tons, and had 25,000 parts. So this would be a truly massive undertaking at a time when there was no such thing as standardized manufacturing. So work is going on. Babbage is working on some other side projects, but the difference engine is always pretty much number 1 in his mind. He doesn't really seek out any other lucrative appointments because he doesn't want to be taken away from working on the engine. In 1827, tragedy strikes in Babbage's life. His father dies in February, and Babbage is upset about this because now he would never have the opportunity to live up to his father's expectations. Now, his father did leave him 100,000 pounds, which left Babbage quite wealthy by the standards of the time. So money was not going to be an issue for Babbage any longer after his father passed. But the fact that he was not able to redeem himself really affected him deeply. His wife, Georgiana, wrote to John Herschel, "He never had the chance to redeem himself, but to feign sorrow on so happy a release would be to me hypocrisy." So Babbage's father, again, very, very difficult man. The relationship was always acrimonious. But again, it upset Babbage greatly. He was never able to live up to what his father expected. So in July of 1827, his son Charles passes away. And then to top it all off, in October of 1827, Georgiana dies in childbirth along with his newborn son. Babbage is completely wrecked by this. He takes a trip to the continent for a year at Herschel's urging to kind of try to get himself back together again. He travels widely for about a year, and he actually wrote about this in his memoirs, but it's very interesting to note that in his memoirs, he does not mention Georgiana directly one time. So it's my belief personally that her death is something he never ever got over. He just, as usual, throws himself into his work. But as I said, I believe it's something he never got over. He never has another serious relationship with a woman, never remarries. While he is on this grand tour, he is appointed Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge, which was a seat held by Isaac Newton. And Babbage calls this the only honor I ever received in my own country. And his feeling about that is something we're going to talk about a little further on. So 1827, a very bad year for Babbage. Meanwhile, back on the home front, Babbage had gotten more money for his engine, so the crown had paid out quite a bit of money by this point. And people are starting to wonder, where is the machine? There's talk that maybe Babbage has been embezzling the people's money and has no intention of producing a machine at all. So Babbage writes to the man who was the foreign secretary at the time, who was this man, Duke Wellington. So Babbage says, look, I've expended 6,000 pounds of my personal funds. I haven't received that back. He's got problems with Clement. Clement is demanding to be paid. There's a lot of pressure on Babbage at this point to get more funding for his machine. But in this letter to the Duke of Wellington, he also points out that there's something else that has changed since the last time they had corresponded about the difference engine. He's come up with a new idea, and that is the analytical engine. Babbage was always somewhat bothered by the limitations of the difference engine. It could only do so much. It could only do certain types of equations that use the method of differences. But what about a machine that could do more? What about a machine that could multiply, divide, and subtract? Now, that was a very significant technological barrier, and it was an order of magnitude above the complexity of the difference engine. He writes in his letter to the Duke of Wellington, I've also come up with this idea for this other machine, which is better than the difference engine in all respects. This kind of sets off a round of internal questioning inside the British government. So they're saying, well, wait a minute, what is it that Babbage wants? Does he want money to finish the difference engine? Does he want to stop work on the difference engine? Does he want to build this new engine? Nobody really knew what was on Babbage's mind. If he was asking for more financial support to build the analytical engine, he wasn't very clear about that. So this confusion kind of goes on and on. So Babbage does ultimately, as I mentioned, he gets more money for the construction of the difference engine. They build a fireproof building to house the difference engine. But eventually in 1834, things finally come to a head. Babbage writes this book called Reflections on the Decline of Science in England and on Some of Its Causes. And Babbage absolutely torches the Royal Society in this book. Babbage looked at the situation with science on the continent, and he saw that scientists on the continent were professionals, they were respected. And then if you look at Britain, if you looked at the people who were running the Royal Society, it was basically based on who you were and who you knew that got you appointments in the Royal Society. Science was still something that was not done by trained professionals. It was mainly done by people who were gentlemen of leisure, who had the free time and the wherewithal to be able to pursue science, kind of as a hobby. It was not professionalized at all. You talk about the concept of a know-it-all. It was still thought at that time in Victorian Britain, it was possible for someone to know everything. Science was nowhere near as specialized as it is now. So Babbage, as was his habit, was not at all subtle in his critique. His friend Herschel actually said, I should essentially slap you in the face because this is so incredibly stupid. Why did you do this? Babbage, being Babbage, was simply doing what he thought needed to be done and saying what he thought needed to be said. And as I mentioned earlier, Babbage, if he believed he was right, he thought he was able to be rude at the same time. The analytical engine, as I mentioned, was able to do a lot more things than the difference engine. And this is this little cartoon by this artist, Sidney Padua, who very, very graciously agreed to allow me to use this. So this is one of the plans for the difference engine. Babbage came up with many, many different variations for the analytical engine. And this, he was always tinkering with things. And this was one of the problems getting the difference engine finished, is he was constantly refining his designs. He was constantly coming up with new things. So if the plan is constantly changing, it's very hard to deliver a finished product. So if we look at the analytical engine, this device displays all the characteristics of a modern computer. It's got a hard disk called the store, which you can see is indicated by the number 1 there. So that's just all these basically banks and banks of number wheels that contain numbers that are stored in memory. Then it's got a CPU, which is called the mill. It's got a power source, which is the steam engine over there to the left of Babbage himself. And it was programmable. It could be programmed by means of punched cards. So you can see there, there's the operation cards, which is indicated by the number 5, and number cards, which is for entering numbers into the machine. And it could also run micro programs. It could do things like conditional branching. Conditional branching means that if you get one result, do this. If you get another result, do that. So that is something that is very much a part of modern computer programming, is conditional branching. And the analytical engine had the capability to do that. But it was also an incredibly complex machine, far more complex than the difference engine. I mean, this thing is like the size of a train. It's a massive, massive machine. If we look at it from a top view here, you can get some idea of just how complicated this thing is. He would have needed thousands and thousands of number wheels that were nearly identical. So this is an order of magnitude beyond the difficulty of building the difference engine. And it appears that Babbage never really thought this thing would get built in his lifetime. I think he kind of always hoped that it would, but I don't think he ever really thought it would happen, just because of the complexity of it. But it captured the imagination of a lot of people. But I do want to talk a little bit about the idea of using punch cards for programming. Many people may be familiar with the old IBM computers. There may even be some folks on this presentation who have actually used them, and they were operated by a series of punch cards. Now that all comes from the Jacquard Loom. Now the Jacquard Loom was built by a weaver, a Monsieur Jacquard, and the way it worked was they had these punched cards, and there were a bank of rods inside the loom. And when the rod went through one of these holes, the loom would not do anything with that particular piece of thread. When the rod hit somewhere where there was not a hole, it would then weave that thread into the pattern. It could generate very, very complicated patterns in silk. This might look like a woodcut. It is not. It is actually a portrait of Jacquard that was created by a Jacquard loom. Prince Albert actually came to Babbage's house one time. Babbage was so fascinated by this portrait, he actually purchased it. And Prince Albert came to Babbage's home and saw this and realized immediately that it was a portrait of Jacquard that had been done on his loom because Prince Albert had seen it before. So that made Prince Albert very near and dear to Babbage's heart. But it also illustrates the levels of British society that Babbage was involved in. Because if Prince Albert is coming to your house, you have well and truly arrived. Babbage is influential, he's popular, he's got a lot of powerful friends. So he's not someone that you can just blow off. Well, in 1842, this man, Sir Robert Peel, was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And Babbage had continued to harangue the British government for more money. And he's talking about this analytical engine now. He hasn't finished the difference engine. And by this point, the British government is into the difference engine to the tune of £17,000. So that is a monstrous sum of money in 1841 in Britain. Babbage continues to demand a meeting with Peel. He's asking the British government, what do you want me to do? Do you want me to continue building the difference engine? Do you want me to build the analytical engine? Do you want me to do nothing at all? By the way, if you don't want me to build the analytical engine, there's always some foreign government that might want me to do it. Finally, Babbage gets a meeting with Sir Robert Peel on November 11th of 1842. Now, Robert Peel was not a man who suffered fools gladly. He was not renowned for his patience. He was not someone you wanted to play around with. He was another strong personality, very much like Babbage. So Babbage goes into the meeting with Peel, and Peel essentially says, Mr. Babbage, we've spent £17,000 and we have no machine. You have no idea when it's going to be finished. And now you're telling us that you've invented this new machine, which will make the machine we previously paid for useless. And Babbage says, well, it's not useless. It'll still do what it's designed to do, but the analytical engine can just do so much more. And oh, by the way, I've worked for a decade and a half on this. I've put all of my personal funds into it. I've received no honors or rewards from my government. So Peel by this time is just done with Babbage. Peel responds essentially, if you haven't received any honors, it's because you've done nothing to deserve any honors. So Babbage at that point essentially storms out of a meeting with the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He wrote in his memoirs, I considered myself to have been treated with great injustice, but that as he was of a different opinion, I could not help myself, on which I got up and wished him good morning. Yes, Charles Babbage stormed out of a meeting with the Prime Minister of Great Britain. That's just the kind of guy he was. But between his book that he had written, just torching the Royal Society, and storming out of a meeting with Sir Robert Peel, it was pretty much the death knell for the difference engine. Clement had already quit working by that time. He wasn't being paid. Eventually, he did end up getting some money out of it. But without Clement, and as I mentioned, there was no standardization in manufacturing. So without Clement, someone coming in to try to build the difference engine would have had to start from scratch. There was no more money coming in from the government. So at that point, it was pretty much done for the difference engine. So Babbage kind of at that point turns toward, and he's doing a number of other things. He's publishing papers, he's doing other projects, but still he's always tinkering with his designs for the difference engine. And now in the story comes a lady some have called the Enchantress of Numbers, and this is Augusta Ada Byron, or Ada Lovelace as she's commonly called, and this is her as a young woman. So she had first met Babbage in 1833, and she was fascinated with the difference engine. She was the daughter of Lord Byron. So that is Lord Byron there on the left. So Lord Byron was pretty much the Elvis of the Victorian era. He was a romantic poet. He was always in the public eye. He was always in the press, and he was a wild man. He loved to shock people. He kept a pet bear at Cambridge. It's rumored that he had an affair with his half-sister. He seems to have had some sort of mental health issue. Some people have said manic depressive or bipolar, but he was a very volatile personality, had a tendency towards violence, drank a lot. But he married Ada Lovelace's mother in 1815. Things almost immediately went bad. So Ada's mother is Anna Isabella Noel Byron. She was the 11th Duchess Wentworth and Lady Byron. So she was the polar opposite of her husband. She was very quiet. She was very intellectual. And somehow she gets attracted to the bad boy Byron was the ultimate bad boy at the time. So they get married in 1815 and things immediately take a bad turn. Byron really starts to show the darker side of his personality. And Byron actually left when Ada was just weeks old. Lady Byron left her husband when Ada was just weeks old. So this was tabloid fodder in Britain. This was like, if there's a modern equivalent, it's like Harry and Meghan. The British tabloids were all over this. Ada Lovelace, from the time she was born, was a celebrity. So she meets Babbage when she was 17 years old in 1833. As I mentioned, she's immediately fascinated with the difference engine. She got married in 1835 to her husband William, ended up having 3 children, but she's associated with Babbage for the rest of her life. So in 1840, Babbage visits Turin to give a lecture, and he talks to a mathematician in Italy named Luigi Membrea. So Membrea writes a paper called Notes on the Analytical Engine. And he has Ada translate it and add notes to it in English, which she does. So Babbage says to her while she's doing this project, you know more about the analytical engine than almost anyone. You should write your own paper, which she does in 1843. So she writes her own Notes on the Analytical Engine in 1843. Babbage, being Babbage, he wanted to include a preface to her paper, which, by the way, she was going to publish basically under her initials. So no one would realize that a woman had written it, because at the time, that was just something that was not done. The fact that Ada Lovelace had an education in mathematics was very unusual for the time. And the reason she had that sort of an education is her mother hoped that that would keep the Byron madness away from her by keeping her sequestered and just raising her with tutors and hoping that education would keep her from inheriting the madness that her father had. So Babbage writes this preface to her paper, which is basically a long list of grievances. Ada Lovelace looks at this and said, "This is not going to fly. You cannot publish this, and I'm not going to allow it. As your friend, I cannot support you in doing this, but it's suicidal. If you ever want to get the analytical engine built, you cannot include this." So she wins the argument. The notes are published in 1843 without Babbage's preface. So contained in the Notes on the Analytical Engine is this called Note G. So Note G is widely considered to be the first computer program. This was basically a programming language which would tell the analytical engine how to calculate Bernoulli's numbers. So it's for this reason that Ada Lovelace is often credited as having written the first computer program. Now, I will say that there is some controversy about this. There are some who allege that Babbage had already come up with this, and that there's evidence of this in his papers, and that she could not have written this on her own. I will say that it's not possible to prove one way or the other. I would also add that it seems that in many cases there was no small amount of sexism involved in that critique, but I think the argument really misses the larger point. And the larger point is this, is that Ada Lovelace saw the potential of the analytical engine in a way that Babbage never did. Ada Lovelace wrote that the analytical engine could do anything that you could figure out how to write a programming language to do it. It was not just a number cruncher like Babbage thought it was. It was a general purpose machine that could do anything that you could figure out how to give it the language to tell it to do. So in that regard, she was very much ahead of her time and very visionary because she understood what this machine could do in a way that its own creator never did. So Ada Lovelace talks to Babbage and she says, look, you handle the science. I'll figure out how to get the money to get the thing built. You have a tendency towards self-destructive behavior when you try to get money or when you try to approach people about this. So let me handle that end of it. I'll use my social connections and I'll get you funding. You just stick to the science. Babbage flatly refuses to do this, and they have a really big falling out over it. And at that point, their association really kind of suffers. But in the late 1840s, people start to notice that Ada Lovelace is not looking very well. She's starting to look frail. Her doctors prescribe laudanum. So laudanum is an opiate. And this was used for various types of pain management before things like morphine. The hypodermic needle hadn't been invented yet. So taking opiates orally is not nearly as effective for pain management as injecting them. So she continues to be in a lot of pain. And in 1851, she's actually diagnosed with uterine cancer. Her mother at that point, as she begins to become weaker, her mother basically steps in and takes over. Her mother was a very domineering person, and she basically banishes Babbage from the situation. She urges her daughter to basically use mesmerism and prayer as a way to manage her pain. Not a very effective means of managing pain from uterine cancer. So she suffered horribly in the last few years of her life. That's a very difficult part of her life to read about, and it's because she did suffer terrible pain as a result of her cancer not being treated. So at one point, She calls in her husband William and has a private meeting with him. She has something she wants to confess. We don't know what it was that she confessed to her husband, but her husband stormed out of the room. He was never the same again, and he basically gives control over everything to Lady Byron. So at that point, Ada Lovelace's mother is running the show, and Babbage cannot get in to see her, which Babbage was still very good friends with Ada Lovelace. So she was deprived at a time when she really needed it of the support of a very good friend at the action of her mother. Ada does pass away in 1852. And at that point, Babbage is still kind of puttering around with the analytical engine. So Babbage is getting on in years as well. And he's kind of developed into this stereotypical cranky, crotchety, bitter old man. He's still angry that the government never recognized his efforts. He is tormented by organ grinders on the street outside his house. And then eventually in 1871, his good friend John Herschel dies. And that was really the last sort of support that Babbage had in his life. As I mentioned, he never remarried. He never really got over his wife's death, in my opinion. So the death of his last friend, I think, was probably what really finished it off for Babbage. And he actually died a few months after Herschel. So after Babbage passed away, his son inherits his writings and all the bits and pieces of the difference engine that were kind of laying around. And he builds this demonstration piece. It's non-functional, but it's supposed to be a part of the mill of the analytical engine. But essentially what happens is after Babbage dies in 1871, nobody really looks at his papers, and he kind of is forgotten until roughly around the 1960s. So I should mention that I talked earlier about how all the components of the modern computer were incorporated into Babbage's design for the analytical engine. They did not, as far as we can tell, they did not affect the design of modern computers. People were just not that aware of Babbage's work. It was largely forgotten until around the 1980s. There's a gentleman named Doran Swade, and Dr. Swade works at the Science Museum in London. And this is Dr. Swade here. Swade decides for Babbage's 200th anniversary or 200th birthday, he wants to build a working copy of one of his engines. So the 200th birthday is in 1991. He wrangles funding from the museum and from private donors to make it happen. And at the cost of £350,000, this was finally built. And this is a working copy of difference engine number 2. There's actually 2 of these that were built. One of them is the Science Museum in London. One of them is the Museum of Computer History in Mountain View, California. So they got it done with 7 days to spare, and as much as possible, Swade wanted to use the methods that would have been available at the time to settle the argument that it could not have been done even if Babbage would have had the resources to do it. Well, they proved that actually not only does the machine work, but yes, it could have been done with the technology Babbage had available. Now, I want to real quick allow you all to watch this thing in action because it is just beautiful. So there's someone standing there cranking this thing, and that is what's providing the power for the machine to work. And then these are the stacks of numerical dials that basically where the calculation is happening. So it's beautiful to watch this thing work, and every once in a while you'll see that an entire stack will lift up. What's happening there is that it's carrying the ones. When it comes around to where it needs to carry, the entire stack will lift up and reset so that it can carry the numbers. Which was a very different, there it is. Right there it's doing carriage. just an incredible piece of technology, and modern scientists worked on getting this thing built. So it would have technically been possible to do during Babbage's time, but it definitely would have been a challenge. Plan28.org is the same scientists who worked on building the difference engine number 2, the working copy, want to actually try to build a working mill for the analytical engine based off of one of Babbage's plans, Plan 28. And that is actually their website where they're giving periodic updates on the project. So Babbage's legacy, he's actually now given a lot more credit for what he did. Ada Lovelace, actually, when the Department of Defense did one of its first computer programs, they actually named it Ada in her honor. That's essentially my entire presentation on Babbage. I'm happy to take your questions. I'll put up my references here. So yes, I see somebody already mentioned in the chat that an early computer language sponsored by the government was named Ada for Ada Lovelace. Yes, that is absolutely true. So as far as my references, I did read one of Babbage's books. Henry Prevost Babbage, who was Babbage's son, wrote Babbage's Calculating Engines. Doran Swade's book, The Difference Engine, I definitely recommend that. Betty O'Toole's book on Ada Lovelace is also an excellent read, as well as the Andrew Woolsey book about Ada Lovelace. And also special thanks to Sidney Padua for allowing the use of her illustration. Did I say IBM did not know about the computer cards from Babbage? That's correct. People were not really aware until the 60s of the kind of work that Babbage had done. Babbage's papers were just in this massive collection at the Science Museum in London, and no one really looked at them for decades after his death. So the modern computer essentially did evolve independently of Babbage's work. All right, so with that, I'll go ahead and bring it to a close for today. Thank you all for joining us. I do appreciate you being here. Please join us next week on Wednesday, September 22nd at noon for Diagnosing Dinos. That is presented by Dr. Jennifer Anay, lead paleontologist and manager of the Natural Science Collection at the Children's Museum of Indianapolis. She is going to be talking about evidence of pathology in the fossil record in dinosaurs. So you're not going to want to miss that. That is going to be a great one. You can register for next week's talk at smv.org. Each talk is free to attend and is open to the first 300 registrants. Thank you again for joining us today. Until next week, stay safe and stay curious.